Hey guys, this video is intended to extend on the video by Scrap Computer concerning skill differences between regions, though I'm looking at it in a more mathematical sense. If you haven't seen said video, I suggest you go and watch it because he raises some very good points. But to summarize, he establishes two main points relevant to this video. The points he establishes can be supported mathematically, but I decided not to bore you with the details of all that. I'll just refer to these as Scrap's laws. Scrap's first law states that if you have a larger server, you have a larger percentage of the total community, and therefore you have a higher percentage of the best players. Scrap's second law states that because larger servers have more of the best players, as according to Scrap's first law, competition at the highest level of those servers is more intense, breeding those good players to tap further into their potential. As a result of Scrap's second law, the skill at a certain tier on a large server will be higher than that expected by a linear extrapolation of that on a smaller server. In somewhat more plain English, even if Oceania, with its 1.71% of the total league population, beats the odds and had the player with the highest potential, that player could never reach that full potential as he'd need players of a similar caliber around him to push his limits. For a somewhat weeby analogy, Vegeta never would have found need to push himself past his limits if he'd never met Goku to compare himself to.
Kakarot's success was like a demon in my head. How could he be a Super Saiyan when I, the Prince of all Saiyans, could not? It seemed like the only thing holding my body together was my one desire, to be better than Kakarot. At times I thought I was losing my mind. Why couldn't I obtain what Kakarot had obtained? It didn't make sense. It was infuriating, and it was my fury that kept me alive.
What that then boils down to is that whilst OCE may have 1.71 of the player base, he will have less than 1.71 of the pro players, because any latent professionals are surrounded by a smaller pool of other latent professionals to push themselves against, and the converse goes for larger servers. How is this relevant, you may ask? Well, what this expansion on Scrap's second law establishes is that the linear methods I'll be using are wrong. I will try to determine how players measure up to the players at the same position on other servers, however my method is inherently generous to the smaller servers. Keep this in mind for later use. I'll call it Baron's Law, which can essentially be stated as the skill of a player on a smaller server is expected to be less than the skill of a player on a large server at the same numerical position. Okay. So the idea is to more mathematically break down the commonly spouted phrase of X Challenger is like Y Bronze, or similar, whether said as hyperbole or in all seriousness. We'll compare one point in one server and find the estimated equivalent on another server. As Korea is the largest server, I'll use it as the benchmark comparison for the other servers. I'm also going to use a visual analogy to help viewers make sense of things easier. Okay. To begin the method, we scale each server's population to the same size on a line, and what we find is that each position corresponds to a different position on the other server, or multiple positions, or somewhere between positions. Doesn't really matter. For the purposes of comparison, this equates the rank 1 players. Whilst they're unlikely to be of equal skill, this will still fit according to Baron's Law, as this would indicate that rank 1 on the smaller server is less than the skill of rank 1 on the large server. However, it really doesn't give us any more information than we already knew. As such, neither first spot nor last spot, as the converse of Scrap's law, are reliable points comparison. Ideally, the median players, or the players who are better than 50% of the population and worse than 50% of the population on their own server, would be a fair comparison for overall server skill. However, this position is hard to pin down. That position's tier would be expected to be the same due to the way the ranking system is set up, although it likely wouldn't be a fair representation anyway, so it wouldn't tell us much at all, and even if it did, generally the information we're more interested in is that of higher tiered players. Okay, so we have to ask ourselves, is there a position that is A. high tier, B. not tier 1, C. distant enough from tier 1 to ignore outliers like Korean smurfs like Dopa taking top ranks on a smaller server, D. at a constant numerical position, and E, at a constant rank position? The answer is yes, and that position is place 200 on any given server, or the lowest ranking that still classifies you as Challenger. This is the perfect point of comparison between servers, and this is the point I'll be comparing. If we draw a line connecting one server's line to another, there's a position found for each and every corresponding position. Mathematically, this has to do with the product of the position chosen and the ratio of the populations of the two servers. For example, where Korea has 26.2% of the total League of Legends population, Japan has just 0.67%. Korea has 39.1 times more players than Japan, and as a result, rank 1 in Japan corresponds to the entirety of ranks 1 through 39 in Korea, or, as stated by Barron's Law, Japanese number 1 is somewhere less than Korea's 39, and we can't say exactly where rank 1 would be on the Korean server, but we can be fairly sure that rank 1 will be worse than the Korean rank 39. However, due to outliers and us generally caring about matters beyond rank 1, let's return to point 200. 200 multiplied by 39.1 is 7,820, and thus we can say that lowest challenger Japanese player would be below rank 7,820 on Korea, which is found at the moment in Diamond 3. And the same can be done for all servers, as shown on this table. However, even this is not the whole story, as this would expect a linear progression of things, which just isn't there. I've heard it said that there's as much of a skill jump between bronze and low diamond as there is from low diamond to high diamond, and I'm sure many of you have heard similarly of some glass ceiling or disconnect between low and high diamond. Personally, I'm high gold on a small server, so I don't have the qualifications to explain why that is of my own experience. However, I have spoken to someone above that disconnect on EU West, thanks Dan, and his take on the matter tends to be on the difference between micro and macro game focused play. At bronze through to low diamond, anyone can carry on just about any champion by simply having mastery of that champion. However, above the mid-diamond threshold, champion mastery is not enough, as every person's attained champion mastery, and the game's focus shifts heavily from mechanics to game knowledge. Because of Scrap's second law, this threshold can be expected to be higher up on the smaller servers and lower on the larger servers, but any claim by Barron's Law becomes largely irrelevant, as the Japanese player who's mastered the macro game will always be higher than the Korean player who is not. That doesn't render all results untrue or unuseful, but it does put a damper on comparisons between servers of extreme population differences. Those of similar sizes fetch more trustworthy comparisons. This brings forth some interesting points. The common debate of EU versus NA can be addressed as well through this. NA has 14.63% of the population, where EU West has 23.56%, or 1.61 times more. As such, the lowest challenger rank on NA would be somewhere below rank 322 on EU West, which puts them somewhere in Master tier. This comparison doesn't demote someone from above the macro threshold to below, and the servers are of more comparable size than that of Japan and Korea, so it's pretty safe to conclude that this is in fact the case. Looking at the ratios, it would be expected that if the servers were combined, a little under 40% of NA challengers would retain status on the combined server. If we could have some absolute measurement of skill, which we can't, this would be subject to some level of difference due to Scrap's second law skewing things away from the linear merge, and the percentage would drop further, and an initial drop would be seen after the merge as NA players found themselves somewhat outclassed. However, over time that same law would improve the average skill of the NA challengers, who now have the EU Wests to compete with too, and it would eventually equalise back to the merge values of just under 40%. Overall though, it could relatively safely be said that the majority of NA Challenger players, at least the bottom 60%, are at or below EU West Master tier. And once again, this is being generous to the smaller server. I'm sorry to my friends in the US, it's not personal, it's just maths. At least you weren't demoted to Diamond like Japan was by Korea. So what would happen if all the servers were merged into a global server? Well, if there were no ping issues and we could throw that issue out the window, the smaller servers would likely be knocked off the boards entirely, as seen when servers compete, which shows why low population servers fetch even fewer pros than would be expected. However, If all populations merged, the percentage of Challenger players from each server would eventually equalise to approximately the same percentage as the population from that server, as all people would be able to compete on an even playing field. Whether or not we'll ever see the results of a server merge firsthand, I don't know. And it would certainly be an interesting thing to see, but the way things are going, there are still limitations on the speed of light and thus the speed of, internet connections. And as such, it's very unlikely. Servers are more likely to split than they are to join, as we've seen before. Well guys, that's all I have to say on the matter. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you've learned something. If you have, leave me a like, leave me a comment, subscribe. Every little bit helps, and I really do appreciate hearing from everyone. Thank you very much for watching, guys. Have a great day.